A struggling single father takes a simple job, repairing an old barn on a quiet farm. He thinks it's just another paycheck. But what he doesn't know, the woman who hired him owns thousands of acres of land and a past that could change both their lives forever. The barn was barely standing. Rain leaked through the broken roof. Silas wiped sweat from his brow, gripping the worn handle of his hammer. Marigold, calm, mysterious. "You fix things without asking questions, don't you, Mr. Calloway?" Silas smirks, replies, "I don't ask questions when I need the money." But maybe he should have. Silas Calloway took a deep breath, letting the crisp autumn air fill his lungs as he stepped out of the old pickup truck. The small house he had rented at the edge of Hopewell wasn't much, but it was a place to start over. A place where he and his son, Finn, could try to build something resembling a home. Finn, a wiry 7-year-old with boundless energy, jumped down from the truck bed, his sneakers crunching against the gravel driveway. His wide, curious eyes scanned their surroundings before turning to his father with an excited grin. "Dad, do you think there's buried treasure here?" he asked, bouncing on his heels. Silas chuckled, ruffling his son's messy blonde hair. "Maybe not treasure, but I have a feeling we'll find something good in this town." They had arrived in Hopewell only the night before, and though Silas had barely begun unpacking, work was already waiting. A job offer had come through from a woman named Marigold Everhart, the owner of an old farm on the outskirts of town. She needed someone to repair a weathered barn on her property, and Silas, a skilled carpenter by trade, had eagerly accepted. Work was work. And for a man who had spent the last few years drifting from one odd job to another, it was exactly what he needed. As Silas drove down the winding country road leading to the Everhart farm, he couldn't help but admire the scenery. Fields of golden wheat stretched across the horizon, swaying gently under the cool breeze. The trees lining the road were ablaze with autumn colors, painting the landscape in fiery reds and oranges. Hopewell felt different from the places he had passed through before. There was something quiet and steady about it, a kind of stillness that settled deep in the bones. When the Everhart farm came into view, Silas slowed the truck, taking in the sprawling land. The farmhouse was a charming relic from another time, with white wooden panels and a wraparound porch. A few feet away stood the barn he'd been hired to repair. Its red paint was faded, and the roof sagged in places, but the structure itself had good bones. Waiting near the barn was a woman dressed in a flannel shirt, jeans, and sturdy work boots. She stood with her arms crossed, studying the barn with quiet intensity. As Silas climbed out of the truck, the woman turned toward him. She had long chestnut-brown hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, and a face that was striking, not in an ostentatious way, but in the way that made you want to keep looking. There was a quiet strength in her eyes that carried stories untold. "Silas Calloway?" she asked, her voice even and steady. He nodded, extending a calloused hand. "That's me. You must be Marigold Everhart." She shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate you coming out so soon. The barn's seen better days, but I'd like to keep it standing for a few more years if possible." Silas glanced at the structure. "Shouldn't be a problem. Mind if I take a closer look?" Marigold gestured for him to go ahead, and he stepped inside. The scent of aged wood and hay filled the air as beams of sunlight streamed through the gaps in the roof. He ran his fingers along one of the support beams, tapping it lightly. "Solid. A good sign." "The framework is still strong," he said, turning to her. "But the roof needs reinforcing, and some of these boards should be replaced before winter sets in." Marigold nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I'll help wherever I can. I'm not much of a carpenter, but I can hold a hammer." Silas smirked. "Not many landowners I've worked for are willing to get their hands dirty. I don't like standing around," she replied simply. That Silas could respect. As they discussed the repair plans, Finn wandered around the property, kicking at the fallen leaves with the enthusiasm only a child could muster. Near the farmhouse, he spotted a small, scruffy dog curled up under the porch steps. "Dad, look!" Finn called out. He crouched down, extending a cautious hand toward the dog. The animal sniffed him hesitantly before its tail wagged in approval. Marigold chuckled. "That's Rusty. He showed up one day and decided to stay. I don't think he belongs to anyone." "Can I keep him?" Finn asked, his eyes shining with hope. Silas hesitated. They were still settling in, and taking on a pet was a big responsibility. But the way Finn clung to the little dog, the way Rusty leaned into his touch as if they had known each other forever, Silas couldn't bring himself to say no. Marigold smiled. "Rusty's been looking for a friend. I think he just found one." Silas glanced at her, seeing something unspoken in her expression, a quiet understanding. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the farm, Silas found himself lingering longer than he intended. There was something about this place, about the way Marigold spoke of it with such devotion, about the way Finn had already made himself at home, that made him pause. He had spent years running, searching for a place where he and Finn could belong. Maybe Hopewell was that place. Maybe this farm, with its weathered barn and its quiet, resolute owner, was the start of something new. Marigold, watching him from the corner of her eye, felt a similar hesitation. She'd been alone for so long, used to keeping people at arm's length. But Silas and Finn carried something with them, a warmth that she hadn't felt in years. As Silas loaded Finn into the truck, Marigold found herself speaking before she could stop. "I make a mean apple pie," she said. "If you're still around this weekend, maybe you and Finn would like to stop by." Silas met her gaze, a slow smile spreading across his face. "We'd like that." As he drove away, Marigold watched the dust settle behind his truck, a strange feeling blooming in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, something had begun to take root. The rhythmic sound of a hammer striking wood echoed through the quiet morning air as Silas Calloway focused on his work. The barn had seen better days, but as he secured a fresh wooden plank against one of the support beams, he could already see the structure beginning to regain its strength. The sun had barely risen above the treetops, but he had started early. Years of carpentry had taught him that morning was the best time to work. The air was cool, the world was still, and he could lose himself in the steady, methodical rhythm of his craft. Somewhere behind him, the crunch of boots on gravel signaled Marigold Everhart's approach. She had made good on her promise to help, though he was still surprised she had insisted. Most landowners he had worked for in the past had preferred to supervise from a distance, offering little more than the occasional comment about his progress. But not Marigold. "Coffee?" she asked, stepping up beside him and holding out a battered thermos. Silas set his hammer down and accepted the cup she poured for him. The rich aroma of black coffee curled into the air between them. He took a sip, nodding his approval. "Strong." Marigold smirked. "I don't do weak coffee." Silas glanced at her, noting the way her sharp green eyes scanned the barn with a mixture of scrutiny and fondness. She wasn't just looking at the structure. She was remembering something. "This place must mean a lot to you," he remarked. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's been in my family for generations. My grandfather built this, born with his own hands. My parents kept it running. I spent my childhood here running through these fields, learning how to ride horses before I could even ride a bike." Her voice softened, tinged with something heavier. "But it's different now," she added. "It's just me." Silas didn't push for more. He understood loss. He had lived with it for years. Instead, he took another sip of coffee and returned, his focus to the barn. "Well, lucky for you, this place still has good bones. With a little work, it'll stand for years to come." She gave him a small, appreciative nod. "That's the hope." For the next few hours, they worked side by side. Silas handled most of the heavy lifting, while Marigold assisted where she could, holding beams in place, measuring planks, passing him tools. She wasn't as practiced as he was, but she was willing to learn, and that counted for something. It was rare to find someone willing to put in the work for something they cared about. By mid-morning, Finn arrived with Rusty trotting happily at his heels. The boy had insisted on bringing the dog to the farm, declaring that Rusty was now officially his business partner. "Business partner?" Marigold asked, amused. Finn nodded seriously. "Yep, Dad fixes things and I make sure nobody slacks." "Off," Silas chuckled. "Guess I better stay on my toes then." Finn's presence brought a lightness to the air. He explored the barn with the same enthusiasm he approached everything, asking endless questions about the tools, the wood, and the structure itself. "Will this barn be like new when you're done?" Finn asked, tilting his head as he examined the half-repaired wall. Silas considered the question. "Not new, but strong. Some things aren't meant to be replaced, just reinforced." Marigold glanced at him at that, as if she understood the meaning behind his words. As they worked, Silas noticed the way Marigold avoided mentioning her family in too much detail, the way her jaw tensed slightly whenever she spoke about the farm's history. Hopewell was a small town. Rumors traveled fast. He had already picked up pieces of the story from casual conversations at the diner. The Everhart family had once been one of the wealthiest landowners in the area. Marigold's father had expanded the business, making smart investments, turning a simple farm into something grand. But after his death, things had changed. The estate had been left to Marigold, but she had no interest in the wealth, the influence, the expectations that came with the Everhart name. She had rejected the idea of selling the land to developers despite pressure from corporate buyers. Instead, she had chosen this life, a quiet existence, tending to the land, keeping the farm running on her own terms. Silas respected that. It wasn't easy to walk away from what the world expected of you. As the afternoon wore on, dark clouds gathered in the distance. The wind picked up, sending leaves skittering across the ground. Marigold looked toward the sky. "Looks like we've got a storm coming." Silas nodded. "We should wrap up for the day. This old barn won't do well in high winds." Finn groaned. "Oh, but we were just getting started." Marigold smiled. "The barn will still be here tomorrow, Finn." Reluctantly, the boy gathered his things while Silas secured their work for the night. By the time they were ready to leave, the first drops of rain had begun to fall. As Silas turned toward his truck, Marigold hesitated. Then, in a voice that was almost too quiet to hear over the rising wind, she said, "You and Finn should come by for dinner sometime. It's been a while since this house had company." Silas met her gaze. There was something open and honest in the way she said it. No pretense, no formality, just a simple invitation. "Yeah," he said. "I think we'd like that." Marigold nodded once, then turned toward the farmhouse. Silas watched her go, something stirring in his chest that he couldn't quite name. The storm rolled in, and as he drove home with Finn chattering in the seat beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that despite the clouds, despite the uncertainty, something about Hopewell felt a little more like home. The rain had not relented overnight. By morning, Hopewell was wrapped in a misty, silver veil, the roads slick with water, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. Silas Calloway watched the droplets race each other down the fogged-up window of his small rented house, sipping the last of his coffee as Finn chattered excitedly at the kitchen table. "Do you think Rusty likes pancakes?" the boy asked, swinging his legs beneath his chair. Silas arched a brow. "Pretty sure Rusty likes anything he can get his paws on." Finn grinned and crumbled a small piece of his pancake onto the floor. Within seconds, Rusty darted forward, snatching up the morsel with an eager wag of his tail. Silas sighed, but didn't have the heart to reprimand his son. Ever since they had arrived in Hopewell, Finn had been lighter, more at ease. Maybe it was the stability, Or maybe it was the quiet magic of the Everhart farm that had already begun weaving its way into their lives. And maybe it was something or someone else entirely. Silas exhaled slowly, pushing that thought aside. Tonight, he and Finn were having dinner at the Everhart farmhouse, per Marigold's invitation. The thought of sitting around a proper dinner table, sharing a meal that wasn't hastily put together from whatever was in the fridge, sent an odd pang through him. It had been a long time since he'd felt the warmth of a home that wasn't. Just a temporary stop along the way, Finn stuffed another bite of pancake into his mouth before tilting his head. "Do you think Miss Marigold eats pancakes?" Silas smirked. "I imagine she does. Why?" "Because she seems kinda serious," Finn said, scrunching his nose. "Like maybe she only eats important grown-up food," Silas chuckled. "I'll be sure to ask her at dinner." By the time Silas and Finn arrived at the Everhart farm that evening, the storm had passed, leaving the fields fresh and glistening beneath the fading sunlight. The farmhouse, though old, had a kind of quiet grace to it, its porch light casting a warm glow against the deepening blue of the sky. Marigold greeted them at the door, her sleeves rolled up, a streak of flour dusted across her cheek. She looked different, softer maybe, less guarded. "Perfect timing," she said. "Dinner's almost ready." Finn beamed. "Did you make pancakes?" Marigold blinked, then laughed. "Not exactly, but close enough." Inside, the farmhouse was a world of its own, cozy, lived in, filled with the scent of baked bread and something slow-cooked. The walls were lined with old photographs, books stacked haphazardly on shelves, a fire crackling in the stone hearth. It felt like a home. As they settled in, Marigold brought out steaming bowls of beef stew and fresh biscuits, setting them down on the sturdy wooden dining table. Finn took a bite and immediately hummed in approval. "Okay, this is way better than pancakes," Marigold smiled. "Glad to hear it." Silas glanced around, taking in the details of the room. "This place has history," Marigold nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Every corner of it has a story." Finn, ever curious, pointed to an old black-and-white photo on the mantel. "Who's that?" Marigold followed his gaze, her face shifting slightly. "That's my father, Elijah Everhart." Silas noticed the way her fingers curled slightly around the edge of the table, the way her voice dipped just enough to reveal something unspoken. "He built this farm up," she continued, "turned it into what it is today. He had big dreams. For it, for me, there was something weighted in those last words, something unfinished." Silas didn't press. He understood that kind of silence, the kind that held memories too tangled to unravel easily. But Finn, unburdened by the unspoken rules of adults, asked the question directly. "Is he still here?" Marigold hesitated, then shook her head. "No, he passed away a few years ago." "Oh," Finn said softly. "I'm sorry." Marigold gave a small smile. "Thank you, Finn." Silas watched her carefully, recognizing the flicker of loss in her eyes. He knew that feeling, that hollow space where someone should be, and for the first time he wondered just how much Marigold Everhart had lost. After dinner, while Finn played, outside with Rusty, Silas found himself standing on the farmhouse porch beside Marigold, both of them watching as the sky darkened, the stars beginning to peek through. "I appreciate the invitation," Silas said. "It's been a while since we've had a real home-cooked meal." Marigold leaned against the wooden railing, her gaze distant. "I figured it was about time this house had company again." A pause settled between them, not uncomfortable but full of meaning. "You don't talk much about your past," she noted after a moment. Silas exhaled. "Not much to talk about." She turned slightly, studying him. "That's not true." He smirked, shaking his head. "Maybe not." Another pause. Then, as if she knew that whatever she said next had to be carefully placed, she asked, "What happened to Finn's mother?" Silas's grip tightened slightly on the railing. It wasn't that he didn't want to talk about it. It was just that talking about it never changed anything. "She passed away," he said finally. "A car accident. Finn was barely 3. Marigold's expression softened, understanding without pity. "I'm sorry." Silas nodded, his throat tight. "You've done a good job with him," she added. "He's a great kid." A small, genuine smile touched Silas's lips. "Yeah, he is." They stood there for a long moment, the sounds of the night wrapping around them, something unspoken passing between them. Finally, Marigold looked at him with an almost imperceptible shift in her expression. Something quiet, something searching. "Sometimes," she said softly, "things don't go the way we planned, but that doesn't mean they can't still be good." Silas met her gaze, and for the first time in a long time, he considered the possibility that she might be right. The past would always be there, a shadow stretching behind them. But maybe, just maybe, there was something ahead worth stepping toward, and maybe, just maybe, Hopewell wasn't just another stop on the road. Maybe it was something more. The sun hung low over the Everhart farm, casting golden light over the fields as Silas Calloway guided his truck down the familiar gravel road. Finn sat beside him in the passenger seat, his small hands gripping Rusty's fur as the dog perched contentedly on his lap. Ever since their dinner at the farmhouse, something had shifted. It wasn't anything overt. Marigold was still the reserved, quietly determined woman she had been when they met. But there was a warmth now, subtle but present, like the first hint of spring after a long winter. Silas had spent the past few days working on the barn, making progress, settling into the steady rhythm of physical labor. It had been years since he'd felt the satisfaction of seeing something broken slowly return to strength beneath his hands. And today, Marigold had invited him and Finn to stay for the afternoon, to share a meal, yes, but also to plant something. "Would you ever plant anything before, kid?" Silas asked, as he slowed the truck near the barn. Finn shook his head. "Nope, but Miss Marigold says it's easy. You just dig, put the seed in, and cover it up." Silas chuckled. "That's the gist of it. But it takes time, patience. You don't see results right away." Finn tilted his head. "Like fixing the barn?" Silas glanced at him, something about the boy's simple observation settling deep in his chest. "Yeah, like fixing the barn." Marigold was already waiting for them near the garden behind the farmhouse, a set of gloves tucked under one arm and a small wooden crate filled with seed packets beside her. She looked every bit the part of someone who had worked the land her whole life, her hair pulled back into a loose braid, dirt already streaking the knees of her jeans. "I hope you two are ready to get your hands dirty," she greeted, handing Finn a small trowel. Finn grinned. "I'm totally ready," Silas smirked. "We'll see about that." Marigold gestured to a row of freshly turned soil. "We're planting wildflowers. This patch has been empty too long." She knelt beside Finn, showing him how to make small indentations in the soil before carefully placing the seeds inside. Silas watched as his son followed her lead, his usual boundless energy momentarily tempered by quiet focus. "It's kind of like magic," Finn mused as he pressed dirt over the seeds. "You can't see them, but they're growing." Marigold smiled. "That's the best part. You have to believe in what you can't see yet." Silas crouched down beside them, rolling up his sleeves. "I take it you've done this since you were a kid?" Marigold nodded, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "My mother loved gardening. She said it was like planting hope." Silas glanced at her, catching the fleeting shadow that crossed her features. He knew that kind of shadow, the kind that lingered even after years had passed. "She passed?" he asked softly. Marigold nodded. "When I was 17. There was no elaboration, no unnecessary details, just the quiet weight of loss." Silas didn't offer platitudes. He simply nodded, understanding all too well the way grief shaped a person, the way it dug its roots deep. For a while, they worked in silence. The kind that wasn't awkward or strained, but easy, like an unspoken agreement that some things didn't need to be said out loud. They had nearly finished planting when the sound of a car rolling up the gravel driveway made them pause. Marigold stiffened, her posture shifting from relaxed to wary in an instant. Silas followed her gaze as a sleek black sedan pulled up in front of the house. A well-dressed man stepped out, his polished shoes an odd contrast to the rustic surroundings. Marigold wiped her hands on her jeans and stood. "Stay here," she murmured to Silas before striding toward the house. Silas exchanged a glance with Finn, silently telling him to keep quiet. Something about the visitor's presence felt wrong, too clean, too intentional. From a short distance, he couldn't hear all of the conversation, but he caught enough. "Marigold, you've been ignoring." "My calls," the man said, his voice smooth, practiced. "I didn't think there was anything left to say," Marigold replied, her voice cool. The man exhaled sharply. "Come on. You know this farm is sitting on a gold mine. It's time to let it go." Silas felt his jaw tighten. He didn't know the full story, but he didn't like the way the man spoke to her, like he was entitled to something that wasn't his. Marigold crossed her arms. "We've had this conversation. My answer hasn't changed." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "You're being stubborn. This isn't what your father would have wanted." Marigold's expression hardened. "You don't get to speak for my father." Silas had heard enough. He rose, brushing the dirt from his hands, and walked over. "Everything okay?" Marigold glanced at him, something flickering in her gaze. Gratitude, maybe. The man studied. Silas, clearly taking in the worn flannel, the calloused hands, the layer of dirt from the garden. His lips curled slightly as if in amusement. "And you are?" Silas didn't rise to the bait. He simply held the man's gaze, steady and unyielding. "Someone who doesn't like watching people get pushed around." The man exhaled through his nose, then turned back to Marigold. "Think about it," he said, "before it's too late." He climbed back into his car and drove off, leaving silence in his wake. Marigold let out a slow breath, her fingers curling. At her sides, Silas didn't ask right away. He gave her a moment, then said, "That kind of thing happen often." She exhaled. "More than I'd like." Silas nodded. "And you keep saying no?" Her gaze met his, unwavering. "Every time." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good." A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She glanced toward the newly planted garden, brushing dirt off her palms. "We should water these before the sun sets." Silas let the conversation shift, knowing she'd tell him more when she was ready. He grabbed a watering can, handing one to Finn, while Marigold took another, and as they stood in the fading sunlight, watering seeds that had yet to grow, Silas couldn't help but feel that something else, something just as unseen, was beginning to take root too. The sky over Hopewell stretched wide and golden as Silas Calloway secured the last wooden beam into place. The barn was finally starting to look whole again. The missing shingles had been replaced, the sagging roof reinforced, and with each stroke of his hammer, it felt like he was putting something back together, not just the barn, but something within himself. Marigold Everhart stood a few feet away, watching his progress with an expression that was both thoughtful and unreadable. It had been a few days since the suited stranger had shown up at her farmhouse, and though she hadn't spoken much about it, Silas could see that it weighed on her. She was strong, that much was clear, stubborn too, but even the strongest people had cracks, and Silas had a feeling that Marigold's cracks ran deep. "Not bad," she finally said, nodding toward the barn. "Almost looks like it belongs here again." Silas smirked, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "That's the goal." She crossed her arms, shifting her weight slightly. "You've done good work." He studied her for a moment. "You say that like you're surprised." Marigold exhaled a quiet laugh. "I guess I am, a little. Most people don't stick around long enough to finish what they start." Silas didn't look away. "I'm not most people." Something flickered in her eyes, something she quickly masked as she turned toward the house. "I made lemonade," she said over her shoulder. "Figured you and Finn might want some." Silas watched her go, sensing that whatever walls she had built around herself had just gotten a little taller. Later that afternoon, as Finn played in the front yard with Rusty, Silas leaned against the porch railing, a cold glass of lemonade in his hand. Marigold sat nearby, watching as Finn chased the dog through the grass. "He's happy here," she observed. Silas nodded, watching his son laugh as Rusty darted between his legs. "Yeah, he is." Marigold hesitated, then said, "You don't talk much about why you came to Hopewell." Silas studied his glass for a moment before answering. "Not much to tell, just needed a fresh start." Marigold arched a brow. "Fresh starts don't happen without something to leave behind." He exhaled slowly. "Finn's mom passed away when he was 3. I spent a lot of time after that trying to outrun the grief. Thought if I kept moving, it wouldn't catch up. With me—" She was quiet for a moment, then softly, "Did it?" Silas let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Yeah, turns out grief doesn't care how fast you run." Marigold swirled her lemonade, watching the ice shift. "I know the feeling." He glanced at her. "Your father?" She nodded. "And my mother before him." Silas had suspected as much. "They built this place from the ground up," she continued, her voice steady but distant. "My father was determined. He wanted to make this farm something bigger than just a plot of land. He had plans, expansion, new investments, but when he passed, people started circling, looking to buy it up, carve it into something unrecognizable." Silas. He thought of the man in the suit. "Like your visitor the other day." Marigold's jaw tightened. "Damon Caldwell. He used to be a family friend, or so I thought." Silas frowned. "He doesn't seem like much of a friend now." She let out a dry laugh. "No, he doesn't." There was something else there, something she wasn't saying, but Silas knew better than to push. That evening, as Silas packed up his tools, a truck pulled into the driveway. It wasn't sleek like Caldwell's car. This one was older, dusty, the kind that had seen years of farm work. A man climbed out, his broad frame familiar even before he stepped into the light. "Marigold," the man greeted, his voice gruff but not unkind. Marigold crossed her arms. "What do you want, Henry?" "Henry Logan." Silas had heard the name in passing around town. He was one of the bigger landowners in the area, someone with deep roots in Hopewell. Henry glanced toward Silas before returning his gaze to Marigold. "Heard Caldwell's been sniffing around again." Marigold exhaled sharply. "And?" Henry shrugged. "And people are talking. Some think it's time you sell before the choice ain't yours anymore." Silas didn't like the sound of that. "Is that a threat?" he asked, stepping forward. Henry held up a hand. "Not from me. But Caldwell's got a way of making things go his way. If he wants this land bad enough, he'll find a way to get it." Marigold's expression didn't waver. "I'm not selling, Henry." Henry studied her for a long moment, then sighed. Stubborn as ever. He turned back toward his truck. "Just be careful, Marigold. Some fights ain't worth it." Marigold didn't answer, and Henry drove off, leaving dust in his wake. Silas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Well, that was ominous." Marigold didn't respond right away. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "This land is my family's legacy. I won't let them take it." Silas held her gaze. "Then you won't have to fight alone." She blinked, as if the thought hadn't occurred to her. "Why do you care?" He shrugged. "Because I know what it's like to lose something that matters." A long silence stretched between them. Then slowly, Marigold nodded. And for the first time, Silas saw something shift in her, just the smallest crack in her defenses. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe she didn't have to do this alone. The late afternoon sun stretched across the Everhart farm, bathing the fields in golden light. The barn repairs were nearly complete, and the land itself seemed to hum with the quiet promise of resilience. But despite the warm glow of the evening, something weighed heavy in the air, something unspoken, like the distant roll of thunder on the horizon. Silas Calloway had felt it ever since Henry Logan's visit. There had been a warning laced in the older man's words, a reminder that people like Damon Caldwell didn't take no for an answer. And the more he thought about it, the more it unsettled him. Marigold, for her part, had barely mentioned it. She had carried on as if nothing had changed, throwing herself into her work, tending to the land as if sheer willpower alone could keep it safe. Silas recognized the defense mechanism. He had done the same thing for years, but pretending something wasn't a problem didn't make it disappear. As the evening cooled, Silas found Marigold near the barn, stacking sacks of feed onto a wooden pallet. She worked with the kind of quiet determination that suggested she was trying to outrun her own thoughts. "You keep moving like that, and you're liable to work yourself straight into the ground," he said, leaning against the barn wall. Marigold didn't pause. "Better than sitting around waiting for problems to find me." Silas watched her for a moment, then crossed his arms. "You can't ignore this, Marigold." She exhaled sharply, dusting her hands off on her jeans. "I'm not ignoring it." "Feels like you are." Her gaze snapped to his, a flicker of frustration behind her green eyes. "What exactly would you like me to do, Silas? Run? Give in? Because I'm not selling, and I'm sure as hell not letting Damon Caldwell bully me off my own land." Silas met her stare, unwavering. "I'm not saying you should, but you need a plan. People like Caldwell don't just go away because you tell them to." Marigold pressed her lips together, as if biting back whatever sharp retort had been on the tip of her tongue. Finally, she let out a slow breath. "I know." Silas stepped closer. "Then let me help." Marigold hesitated, as if the idea of accepting help was a foreign concept to her. Silas softened his tone. "I know what it's like to feel like you have to do everything alone. But you don't." Her gaze searched his for a moment before she nodded, small, but enough. Before either of them could say more, the wind picked up, rustling the fields with a sudden, restless energy. Overhead, dark clouds had begun to creep in, swallowing the last hints of blue sky. Marigold frowned, glancing upward. "That wasn't in the forecast." Silas narrowed his eyes at the horizon. "Could be nothing, or it could be trouble." Just as the words left his mouth, a sharp gust of wind sent an old metal bucket skittering across the barn floor. Finn and Rusty, who had been playing near the farmhouse, came running. "Dad, look at the sky." Finn pointed toward the thickening storm clouds. "It's moving fast." Silas felt it in his gut. This wasn't an ordinary storm. Marigold was already moving. "We need to get the animals secured before the worst of it hits." They sprang into action, herding the livestock into the safety of the stables as the wind howled through the trees. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy against the dry earth. Lightning flashed in the distance. Silas guided Finn toward the house. "Stay inside with Rusty, all right?" Finn looked reluctant, but nodded, running toward the farmhouse with the dog at his heels. By the time Silas turned back to the barn, the storm had fully arrived. Sheets of rain pummeled the land, the wind threatening to rip through anything in its path, and then he saw it, the north fence, already weakened by time and wear, bowing dangerously under the force of the storm. "Marigold," he shouted over. "The wind. The fence is gonna go." She turned just in time to see it buckle, the wooden posts snapping like twigs. Without thinking, she ran toward it. Silas cursed under his breath and bolted after her. Marigold reached the broken fence first, grabbing hold of a loose section before the wind could carry it away. But the force of the storm was relentless, the rain blinding. Silas reached for her arm. "Marigold, let it go. It's not worth getting yourself hurt over." She shook her head, her grip tightening. If the cattle get loose, lightning struck a tree in the distance, the crack of thunder so loud it rattled the ground beneath them. Silas didn't hesitate. He wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her away just as another gust of wind sent debris flying through the air. They stumbled back toward the barn, rain-soaked and breathless. Marigold turned in his arms, ready to protest, but before she could say a word, Silas gripped her shoulders. "You can't save everything by yourself," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Not at the risk of yourself." Marigold's breath hitched, the fire in her eyes flickering for just a moment. She exhaled. Then finally she nodded. They stood there for a beat, rain dripping from their hair, their clothes clinging to their skin. The storm raged around them, but for a moment it felt like they were standing in the eye of it, just the two of them, caught in something neither of them fully understood yet. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm began to pass. By the time they made it back to the farmhouse, Finn was waiting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, Rusty pressed against his side. "Are you guys okay?" he asked, eyes wide with worry. Silas ruffled his son's hair. "Yeah, buddy, just a little wet." Marigold gave Finn a small smile. "Nothing a warm drink can't fix." Inside, the house was quiet, save for the occasional drip of water from their soaked clothes onto the wooden floor. Marigold disappeared for a moment and returned with 2 towels, handing one to Silas without a word. As she dried her hair, she glanced out the window toward the storm-darkened fields. "You were right," she murmured. "I can't do this alone." Silas looked at her, something settling in his chest. "You don't have to." A silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. A new kind of understanding. Outside, the last remnants of the storm faded into the distance, and in its wake something else had begun to take root. The storm had passed, but the damage remained. Silas stood by the north fence at dawn, hands on his hips, surveying the wreckage left behind. The wooden posts lay splintered and scattered, the wire fencing torn free and tangled like discarded thread. The cattle, thankfully, had been kept safe in the barn overnight, but without repairs they wouldn't be contained for long. Behind him, Marigold approached, 2 mugs of steaming coffee in her hands. She handed one to him wordlessly, her gaze fixed on the ruined fence. Silas took a sip, savoring the heat against the cool morning air. Not as bad as it could have been. Marigold let out a quiet laugh, though it lacked humor. "That's one way to look at it." Silas glanced at her. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, betraying a restless night. He knew why. It wasn't just the storm that had kept her awake. It was everything. Damon Caldwell, the land, the weight of it all pressing down on her shoulders. "You didn't sleep, did you?" he asked. Marigold exhaled, rubbing the back of her neck. "Not much." Silas hesitated, then said, "You want to tell me what Caldwell has over you?" Marigold tensed, but she didn't deflect. Instead, she was quiet for a long moment, staring out over the fields, as if searching for an answer among the rolling hills. Finally, she spoke. "My father, he made a deal with Caldwell years ago, before he passed." Silas frowned. "What kind of deal?" Marigold tightened her grip on her coffee mug. "A bad one." She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "My father was ambitious. He wanted to expand the farm, make it more than just a family-run operation. Caldwell was his investment partner. He funneled money into my father's plans, but when my father got sick, things unraveled. The debts caught up, and Caldwell, he took advantage of it." Silas's jaw tightened. "Let me guess. Now he thinks he's entitled to the land." Marigold nodded. "Legally, he doesn't have a claim, But he knows how to apply pressure. He's already gotten several of our old suppliers to stop working with me. He's made sure bank loans won't go through. He's trying to force my hand." Silas exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Bastard." Marigold's lips quirked in wry amusement. That's one word for him. Silas studied her. She had been carrying all of this alone, fighting to hold on to something that had been slipping through her fingers since the moment her father passed, and she wasn't giving up. That kind of fight. It did something to a person. It hardened them. But it also made them stronger. Silas recognized it because he had lived it. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steady. Marigold looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something. "Why do you care so much?" Silas held her gaze. "Because I know what it's like to lose something that mattered, and I know what it's like to have no one in your corner when it happens." A beat of silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Then finally Marigold nodded. They spent the morning working on the fence, replacing broken posts and restringing the wire. It was slow, grueling work, but neither of them complained. The physical labor was a welcome distraction. Finn joined them after breakfast, eager to help, though he mostly ran around keeping Rusty from causing trouble. The dog had developed a habit of stealing tools and proudly parading them around the field, much to Finn's delight. By midday, the worst of the damage had been repaired. Marigold wiped sweat from her brow, sighing. "That's a start." Silas dusted off his hands. "Next step is figuring out how to keep Caldwell from pushing you any further." Marigold exhaled, resting against the newly repaired fence. "I don't know how to stop him. He's got influence, money, people in his pocket." Silas considered her words. Then an idea formed. "You still have friends in this town, right?" he asked. Marigold hesitated, then nodded. "A few." Silas crossed his arms. "Then let's use that. Let's remind this town what the Everhart farm means. If Caldwell is trying to pressure you into selling, the best way to fight back is to make sure the town knows what's at stake." Marigold frowned. "And how do we do that?" Silas smirked. "We make the farm essential to them. If people have a reason to rally behind you, Caldwell loses leverage." She studied him, thoughtful. "You think that'll work?" Silas shrugged. "I think it's better than doing nothing." For the first time all day, something like hope flickered in Marigold's expression. That evening, as they wrapped up for the day, Marigold surprised Silas with something unexpected. She had cooked. Not just something small, but a full meal. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh biscuits. It was warm, hearty, and smelled like something out of a memory. Silas blinked as she set the plates down. "Didn't expect this," Marigold smirked. "Figured you deserve something for putting up with me today." Finn, already digging into his plate, mumbled through a mouthful of food. "Miss Marigold, you should cook for us every night." Silas laughed. "Finn!" Marigold just shook her head, smiling. For a while they ate in easy conversation. It was nice. Comfortable. As the evening stretched on, Silas found himself watching Marigold in quiet moments, when she smiled at Finn, when she glanced out the window, when she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear absent-mindedly, and he realized something. This wasn't just about the land anymore. Something else had taken root, something neither of them had planned for, and maybe, just maybe, it was worth fighting for too. The days following the storm passed in a blur of work, planning, and quiet moments that lingered longer than they should have. The farm, once a solitary place that bore the weight of Marigold Everhart's determination alone, had begun to feel different, busier, fuller. Silas Calloway had become a steady presence. He had spent every day repairing fences, checking the barn's foundation, and, without being asked, helping Marigold navigate the growing problem of Damon Caldwell's interference. He wasn't just fixing wood and nails. He was reinforcing something that had been crumbling long before the storm, and Marigold, despite her stubborn independence, was beginning to realize how much she needed him there. It wasn't just about the work. It was about how he saw the farm, the way she did, not just as land, but as something worth holding on to, something worth fighting for. Silas's idea had taken root faster than either of them had expected. Word had spread through town about Caldwell's attempt to force Marigold out, and people were beginning to pay attention. The Everhart farm had been a part of Hopewell for generations. Families who had once worked the land, who had bought produce from Marigold's father, who had attended summer festivals in the fields, suddenly realized what was at stake. Marigold hadn't asked for help, but it came anyway. One by one, people started showing up, old friends, neighbors, even those who had been distant since her father's passing. Some brought supplies, others offered labor, and a few, like Mrs. Thompson, the town's best baker, simply stopped by to remind Marigold that she wasn't alone. Silas watched as Marigold tried to process it all, as she stood in the middle of her land while people worked around her, reinforcing fences, clearing debris, making sure the farm looked better than it had in years. She was overwhelmed, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't because she felt outnumbered. It was because she wasn't fighting by herself anymore. That evening, after the last of the volunteers had gone home, Marigold sat on the farmhouse porch, a warm breeze rustling the leaves. Silas joined, handing her a glass of sweet tea. She took it without a word, staring out at the fields that stretched beyond the fence line. "They showed up," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Silas nodded. "Yeah, they did." She exhaled slowly, then turned to look at him. "Why?" He frowned. "Why what? Why do you care so much about this place? About me?" Silas leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. He didn't answer right away, choosing his words carefully. "I've been drifting for a long time," he admitted. "Never stayed anywhere too long, never had a reason to." Marigold studied him, waiting, but here, he glanced toward the barn, the house, the land that had already taken up space in his heart. "Feels different." Marigold swallowed hard. "Different how?" Silas met her gaze. "Like maybe it's something I don't want to leave behind." A silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Then, softly, Marigold said, "I don't want you to leave either." The words were barely above a whisper, but they landed like a thunderclap. Silas's chest tightened. There were 1,000 things he could have said in that moment, 1,000 ways he could have responded, but instead he just reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against hers, testing the space between them. Marigold didn't pull away, and for now that was enough. The next morning, the quiet peace of the farm was shattered. A sleek black car pulled into the driveway, its polished exterior an ugly contrast to the dust and grit of the land. Silas stiffened as Damon Caldwell stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit with an air of practiced confidence. Marigold stood beside Silas, her expression carefully. Blank, Caldwell smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You've been busy, Marigold," she crossed her arms. "If you came here to talk me into selling again, you're wasting your time." Caldwell's gaze flickered to Silas, taking him in with quiet scrutiny. "I see you've made some new acquaintances." Silas didn't react. He just held the man's gaze, steady and unyielding. Caldwell sighed. "Look, Marigold, I don't want this to get ugly. I've been patient. But you and I both know this farm is a liability. You're running out of time, out of options." Marigold's jaw tightened. "We'll see about that." Caldwell tisked under his breath, shaking his head. "You've always been difficult, just like your father." Silas stepped forward before he could stop himself. "You should leave." Caldwell's gaze darkened, but he smiled anyway. You must be the handyman. Silas didn't rise to the bait. I said leave. For a moment, Caldwell looked like he might push further, but then he let out a slow breath, stepping back toward his car. Have it your way, he said. But don't say I didn't warn you. And with that, he was gone. The moment the car disappeared down the road, Marigold let out a shaky breath. Silas turned to her. Are you okay? She hesitated, then shook her head. No, Silas exhaled. You know he's not done, right? Marigold nodded. Yeah, I know. Silas studied her, then said, We need to be ready for whatever comes next. She looked at him, something unreadable in her expression. Then finally she nodded. They were in this together now. And there was no turning back. The Everhart farm was awake before dawn. Marigold had barely slept, her mind running in circles around the conversation with Damon Caldwell the day before. His presence lingered like a storm cloud over the land, heavy and unavoidable. She had always known this fight wasn't over, but for the first time she wasn't facing it alone. Through the kitchen window, she could see Silas already outside, checking the newly reinforced fences. He had stayed late the previous night, making sure every weak spot had been shored up, every entrance secured. She hadn't asked him to. He had done it anyway. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled her most. Because the more Silas Calloway became a part of this place, the harder it was to imagine him leaving, and that terrified her. By the time the sun had fully risen, Marigold found Silas near the barn, tightening the last of the bolts on the repaired gate. You're making a habit of working before breakfast, she said, leaning against the fence. Silas smirked. Guess I've got something worth waking up for. She rolled her eyes, but the warmth in his voice settled deep in her chest. Then, as if remembering the weight of reality, she said, I don't suppose you have any miracle solutions for dealing with Caldwell? Silas set down his wrench, wiping his hands on a rag. Not miracles, just strategy. Marigold folded her arms. Let's hear it. Silas leaned against the fence beside her. Caldwell's trying to make this personal. He wants you to feel isolated, outnumbered. Marigold exhaled. And it's working. Silas shook his head. Not anymore. People are standing with you now, and if we can prove this farm is essential to the community, we make it harder for him to force you out. Marigold frowned. We've already rallied people. What more can we do? Silas's gaze was steady. Make it official. Turn this place into something bigger than just a farm. Marigold arched a brow. You're suggesting I open a theme park? Silas smirked. Not exactly, but you've got land, resources. What if we start hosting a weekly market? Invite local vendors, turn this into a gathering space. If the town sees this farm as an asset, Caldwell's leverage weakens. Marigold stared at him, surprised at how much thought he had put into this. She had spent years feeling like she was fighting this battle alone. Now here was a man who not only stood beside her, but had started thinking ahead, planning a way forward. And that scared her more than Caldwell ever could, because hope was dangerous. Hope meant opening herself up to the possibility that things could get better, that she might not lose everything, and that, if she wasn't careful, she might lose her heart to this man before she even realized it was gone. Before Marigold could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel interrupted the moment. A truck pulled up, kicking up a small cloud of dust. Henry Logan stepped out, removing his hat as he approached. Marigold, he greeted with a nod. Silas. Silas returned the nod, but Marigold was already wary. Henry had always been neutral, one of the few large landowners in town who hadn't sided with Caldwell, or with her. If he was here, it wasn't for a social call. What can I do for you, Henry? Marigold asked. Henry exhaled, shifting his hat in his hands. I came to talk about Caldwell. Marigold stiffened. If you're here to convince me to sell—" Henry held up a hand. "I'm not, but I'm telling you, he's making moves, quiet ones. He's been talking to the county board, hinting at development projects that require underutilized land." Silas frowned. "Meaning?" Henry looked at them both, his expression grim. "Meaning, if he can't buy you out, he's gonna try and take the land through eminent domain." Marigold felt her stomach drop. Eminent domain, the legal loophole that allowed the government to seize private property for public use. If Caldwell could convince the county that his plans were in the town's best interest, he wouldn't need her permission. She could be forced out, her hands clenched at her sides. "That son of a—" Silas cut in before she could finish. "What's our timeline?" Henry sighed. "Nothing's filed yet, but if he gets the right people on his side, it won't take long. A few weeks, maybe." Marigold's heart pounded. She had spent years fighting to keep this land. Now she might lose it anyway. Silas, however, was already thinking ahead. What would it take to stop it? Henry studied him, then Marigold. Community opposition. Proof that this land isn't underutilized. If you can show that the farm is vital to Hopewell, you might be able to block it. Marigold exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her forehead. It wasn't impossible, but it wasn't easy either. She looked at Silas. "That market idea of yours. We need to do it. Fast." Silas nodded. "Then let's get to work." That night, after Finn had gone to bed and the house had gone quiet, Marigold found Silas on the porch, staring out at the darkened fields. She stepped beside him, arms crossed. "Against the evening chill, this plan of yours, do you really think it'll work?" she asked. Silas glanced at her. "I think it's worth trying." She studied him, searching his face for something, doubt, hesitation, anything. But all she found was quiet certainty. "You never told me why you came to Hopewell," she said. Silas was silent for a long moment. Then finally he spoke. "I lost my wife in an accident," he said softly. "Finn was too young to remember, but I do. I spent years moving from place to place, thinking maybe if I kept running I wouldn't have to face it." Marigold felt a pang in her chest. "And now?" Silas turned to her, his gaze steady. "Now, for the first time in a long time, I don't feel like running." Marigold swallowed. "Because of the farm?" Silas didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, "Because of you." Her breath caught. She had spent so long fighting to hold onto this land, never once expecting someone to fight for her too. And yet, here he was, standing beside her, choosing to stay. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing at all. Instead, she reached out, hesitantly, cautiously, and took his hand. Silas squeezed her fingers gently, as if to tell her that whatever came next, they'd face it together. And for the first time in years, Marigold Everhart let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry this fight alone anymore. The morning air was thick with purpose. Marigold Everhart had spent years waking up to the same routine, tending to the land, keeping the farm afloat, fighting battles no one else saw. But today was different. Today, she wasn't fighting alone. The town had rallied behind her. After Henry Logan's warning, Silas had wasted no time. He had spent the past few days calling in favors, speaking to local business owners, spreading the word. The Everhart farm wasn't just another piece of land. It was a part of Hopewell's history, a place that had fed generations, a space that belonged to the town as much as it did to Marigold. And now the people of Hopewell were making that known. By midday, the Everhart farm had been transformed. Tents and stalls had been set up in the open fields. Farmers and artisans brought their goods, fresh produce, handmade crafts, baked goods that filled the air with the scent of cinnamon and honey. Families arrived with children in tow, the sound of laughter ringing through the farm like a melody. Marigold hadn't heard in far too long. This wasn't just a market, it was a statement, a declaration that this land mattered, that it wasn't underutilized, that it wouldn't be taken away without a fight. Marigold stood near the barn, watching, as people moved between the stalls, exchanging goods, sharing stories. She had been so focused on survival that she had forgotten what the farm could be, what it had once been. A hand brushed against hers. She turned to find Silas standing beside her, his expression unreadable, but warm. "This is because of you," she murmured, taking in the sight before her. Silas shook his head. "This is because of you. People needed a reason to fight for this place. You gave them one." Marigold swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "I almost lost it." Silas met her gaze. "But you didn't." And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't. But Damon Caldwell wasn't finished yet. He arrived late in the afternoon, his sleek black car kicking up dust as he pulled into the driveway. He stepped out, surveying the bustling market with an expression that was equal parts amused and annoyed. Silas saw him first. He immediately stepped forward, his stance firm, protective. "You lost?" Caldwell smirked. "Not at all. Just came to admire the show." Marigold joined Silas, her spine straight, her chin lifted. "If you're here to try and intimidate me, you're wasting your time." Caldwell sighed, brushing imaginary dust off his expensive suit. "You really think this changes anything?" He gestured to the market. "You think a few people buying homemade jam is going to stop progress?" Silas took a step forward. "I think a town that stands together is a hell of a lot harder to push around." Caldwell's eyes flickered toward him, the smirk never leaving his face. "You've certainly become invested, haven't you, handyman?" Silas didn't flinch. "You could say that," Caldwell exhaled as if he were dealing with children. "It's cute, really. But I don't think you understand how this works. I don't need Marigold to sell anymore. The county is already listening. Eminent domain is a process, and once it's in motion, no amount of farmers' markets will stop it." Marigold's pulse pounded. She knew he was bluffing. He had to be, but the confidence in his voice, so certain, so casual, made her stomach twist. And then, just as quickly as he had arrived, Caldwell turned on his heel. "I'll be in touch," he called over his shoulder. Then he drove away, leaving tension in his wake. As soon as Caldwell was gone, Marigold let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over her face. "He's lying," Silas said beside her, his voice firm. "He has to be." Marigold exhaled shakily. "And what if he's not?" Silas turned to her, his eyes steady, unwavering. "Then we fight harder." Marigold searched his face, finding nothing but certainty there. She had spent so long preparing. For the worst, for loss, for the inevitability that this farm, this home, would be taken from her. But Silas believed in something else, and for once she wanted to believe in it too. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. Silas's fingers curled around hers without hesitation. No matter what came next, they would face it. Together, and that, at least, was something Damon Caldwell would never understand. The sun rose over Hopewell, painting the Everhart farm in hues of gold and amber. The storm had passed, not just the one that had shaken the fields, but the one that had threatened to take everything Marigold had fought for. And she had won. Damon. Caldwell's last play had failed. The town had spoken. The overwhelming support from the community, the farmers' market, the outpouring of public opposition, the legal pushback from Henry Logan and other local landowners had been enough to stop the county board from granting Caldwell the power to claim the land. The Everhart farm was safe. Marigold stood at the edge of the fields that morning, breathing in the crisp autumn air. The land stretched before her, strong, unbroken, and for the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. Silas approached quietly, as he always did. She could hear the steady sound of his boots against the earth before she turned to see him standing beside her, hands in his pockets, watching the sunrise. "It's beautiful," he said. Marigold nodded. "Yeah, it is." They stood in silence for a moment, taking it all in, the fields, the farmhouse, the sound of Rusty barking as Finn chased him through the yard. It was theirs, and it wasn't going anywhere. "You did it," Silas said eventually, his voice warm. Marigold turned to him. "We did it." A small smile played at his lips. "Guess that means I'm officially stuck here then." Marigold arched a brow. "Oh? Were you planning on leaving?" Silas studied her for a long moment before shaking his head. "No, not anymore." Something in her chest tightened, not with fear, but with certainty. She reached out, hesitantly at first, then more sure of herself, taking his hand in hers. "Good," she murmured, "because I don't want you to." Silas's fingers tightened around hers, and for the first time in a long time, Marigold let herself lean into something other than survival. She let herself believe in more. The weeks that followed were filled with laughter, with work, with rebuilding, not just fences and barns, but lives. The market had become a permanent fixture, drawing in visitors from beyond Hopewell, strengthening the farm's place in the community. Finn had started helping with chores, declaring himself official farmhand as he followed Silas around, learning everything from fixing loose boards to tending to the animals. Rusty, never far from his side, had made it his personal mission to ensure no visitor left without at least one paw print on their clothes, and Silas was there. Every day, every morning beside her, every evening sharing quiet moments on the porch, every step woven into the fabric of this life they were building together. One evening, as they sat watching the sun dip below the horizon, Marigold exhaled, a slow breath. "This place was always home," she said softly. "I just didn't realize how lonely it had become." Silas turned to her, his gaze steady, warm. "You're not alone anymore." Marigold met his eyes, and for the first time in years, she believed it. One afternoon, Finn came running toward them, dirt smudged on his cheeks, excitement lighting up his face. "The flowers!" he exclaimed, tugging at Marigold's sleeve. "Come see!" Curious, she followed him to the patch of soil they had planted weeks before, where tiny green shoots had begun to break through the earth. Silas knelt beside Finn, running a hand over the fresh sprigs. "They made it." Finn grinned. "Miss Marigold said, you just have to believe in what you can't see yet." Marigold felt her throat tighten, because it was true, not just for the flowers, but for herself, for this land, for the life she never thought she'd have again. Silas reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I think we planted more than just flowers that day." Marigold smiled, resting her hand over his. "Yes," she murmured. "I think we did." As the farm settled into a new rhythm, as the seasons prepared to shift once more, Marigold stood with Silas by her side, watching the world they had fought for come to life. Hopewell had given her so much, challenges, heartbreak, battles she never asked for, but it had also given her him. And with Silas beside her, hand in hers, she knew one thing for certain. Some things were worth holding on to, some battles were worth fighting, and some seeds, once planted, would bloom into something more beautiful than she had ever imagined. What do you think about this story? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories like this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.